I'm Marty Stauffer. Many of us have a special place where we can relax and escape the pressures of everyday life. Maybe it's a favorite spot in the woods, or a quiet corner of a room, or even a secret place in our minds. If we're lucky, we can find a peaceful refuge. But what about wildlife? Our modern way of life has claimed much of the land that once meant peace and quiet for our native animals. Where can these creatures go to find not only the space and solitude that man sometimes craves, but the very elements basic to their survival? The answer is our national wildlife refuges. America is fortunate in having the greatest wildlife refuge system in the world. From Florida to Alaska, millions of acres have been set aside for the primary benefit of wild birds and animals. Within these havens, hundreds of species thrive and interact as they have for countless generations. Many of these creatures could not exist today without a wild refuge.
Because Americans have gradually learned to treasure wildlife, creatures such as the Canada goose and the white-tailed deer are still a familiar part of our heritage. It could easily have happened otherwise. Earlier in our history, many species were destroyed forever by indifference and by greed. Egrets and other wading birds were severely overhunted for the commercial value of their elegant feathers. Unfortunately, these plumes were at their finest during the breeding season. For each parent bird killed, a whole brood of young egrets would starve to death. The egret population was decimated, all for a few feathers, all in the name of fashion. At the turn of the century, there were few organized citizens groups to protest such destruction. But fortunately, America then had a concerned and effective president who was also a naturalist. Among many foresighted acts was Teddy Roosevelt's establishment in 1903 of the country's first national wildlife refuge. Pelican Island in Florida was set aside to protect the nesting grounds of the brown pelican. Today, colonies of them once again thrive, and the original 3-acre Pelican Island is now part of a system which has grown to include more than 400 refuge areas in 49 states. These refuges protect thousands of species of animals and birds, including nearly 70 that are endangered. Alaska alone has at least 17 of these sanctuaries, including the largest, the 18-million-acre Arctic National Refuge. Preserving our irreplaceable natural heritage is an idea which has, like the acorn, slowly taken root in reality. We have come to understand the interdependency of all living things, and to see that the greatest threat now to any species is loss of habitat. Just as the acorns dropped from one oak tree can create an entire forest, so the refuge system shelters not only individual animals, but all of nature's magic and mystery. How does man benefit? Coastal refuges, such as Eastern Neck on Maryland's Chesapeake Bay, protect estuaries, vital to America's fishing industry. Inland, a great many refuges help to regenerate the nation's water supply and to control flooding. Above all, they offer a place for man to regenerate his own spirit by observing the natural world. Many refuges encompass several types of habitat. Eastern Neck, for example, supports not only waterfowl, but also one of the last remaining populations of the endangered Delmarva fox squirrel. This large, handsome native is often seen playing around refuge headquarters, which occupy what was once a private hunting lodge. Each of these sanctuaries is unique. Blackwater Refuge, for instance, is also located on Chesapeake Bay, only miles from Eastern Neck, yet it hosts distinctively different populations. Eagles, rare at Eastern Neck, are common at Blackwater. Blackwater also has a colony of Delmarva fox squirrel, plus 2 other endangered species, the red cockaded woodpecker and the southern bald eagle. Magnificent flocks of ducks and geese are a thrilling sight at both refuges. Most refuges allow visitors, and sunrise or sunset is my favorite time to visit any refuge area. These are the best hours to gain a sense of nature's tranquility and to see the amazing variety of her timeless patterns. Often we forget just how much activity continues on into the night, or underground, unseen, but nonetheless essential. Bats may not be everyone's favorite, but think how heavily they figure in the control of insect pests. If species, such as these endangered Indiana brown bats, were to disappear, we would be far more dependent on chemical pesticides. There really are no insignificant species. Each one contributes to the survival of others, including man, many in ways that we are not even aware of. Refuges, set aside for the protection of one type of bird or animal, often support many others. This can readily be seen at 90,000-acre Aransas Refuge along the Texas coast, winter quarters of the magnificent whooping crane. Here, the spectacular courtship dance of America's tallest bird takes place among white-tailed deer, herons, and white pelicans. Despite the threat of nearby oil wells, Aransas remains a fragile reminder of what paradise might be. Our refuge system includes nearly every conceivable type of climate and habitat, from rainforest to desert. A newly hatched brood of Harris hawks will make their first flight from a giant saguaro cactus that probably started growing around the time our Declaration of Independence was signed. Life in the desert is fragile and harsh, living things few and far between. Without refuges, it would be easy for the last member of an endangered species, like the desert tortoise, to disappear into oblivion without anyone taking notice. Desert refuges ensure that such creatures will have a chance to survive, as they have for millions of years, on their own specially evolved terms. Birds must contend for increasingly limited space and food, not only with members of their own species, but also with other birds and animals that have the same preference in diet and living quarters. The red-tailed hawk and the bald eagle are old enemies for this reason. Migratory birds, including this peregrine falcon, follow certain broadly defined routes called flyways in their travels north and south. Along these paths, refuge areas offer opportunities to find food, and they ensure safe destinations at both ends of the journey. No refuge guarantees any bird or animal protection from nature's inevitable ways. Rather, they provide a small measure of security, a last line of defense against the whims and fancies of man. At prairie refuges, such as Fort Niobrara in Nebraska, life goes on as it has since the dawn of history. Grazing, mining, lumbering, and even recreation on any large scale are seldom compatible with wildlife. Yet the federal government responsible for supporting the refuge system has, in recent years, encouraged an increase in activities which are hardly intended for the primary benefit of wildlife. Hunting is allowed on nearly half of our refuges. Many people consider this an unfair trick to play on wildlife in a sanctuary. Yet hunters and hunting contribute much of the support and revenue that makes wildlife management possible. It's a complex and sometimes controversial situation. There are other problems. On several refuges, native wildlife must compete with feral animals, such as ponies, horses, and burros. Yet these animals, too, are, in some ways, part of our heritage. More difficult to defend is the occasional importation of non-native birds and animals, such as these African oodads, which put an added strain on limited refuge resources. Individual refuges face constant problems and conflicts, but the refuge system as a whole has done much to increase our understanding of wildlife. At Eastern Neck, for instance, records are kept which add greatly to our knowledge of the habits of migratory waterfowl. It's hoped that hunters and other observers will report sightings of the numbers on these goose collars. In this way, more accurate predictions can be made about how best to provide for their welfare. In the vast, rugged expanse of Alaska's wilderness, we can still see a measure of our own untamed past. For most of the country, wildness on such a grand scale is gone forever. But in Alaska is hope for the future. Here, massive unspoiled ecosystems have already been set aside, intact, to protect their original inhabitants. Alaskan brown bear, Dall sheep, moose, and the great herds of caribou are only a few of the magnificent creatures that fill this teeming land. with its thousands of miles of mountains, tundra, and shoreline. It would be incredibly sad if we allowed such incomparable grandeur to be trapped and hunted, manipulated and displaced until it could no longer be called truly wild. But the same pressures that constantly chip away our natural heritage in other parts of the country are at work here. The same Alaskan Conservation Act that in 1980 added 54 million acres of new lands to Alaska's refuge system also leaves each of those refuges wide open to oil and gas development. These beautiful animals are as much a part of America as the bison. Do we wish to see their ancient migration routes restricted, or their numbers reduced to a few isolated bands? The issues are complex, but the answer is clear.
By providing food and shelter, you could create a mini refuge right in your own neighborhood or backyard. This will encourage wild visitors to remain in or to return to areas where otherwise they might never be seen again. Or you could encourage your community to set aside protected habitat, especially for birds and animals. Keeping our national wildlife refuges in their original state is one of the best ways to provide for the lasting vitality of all of our native creatures. And these places provide us with a special opportunity to discover our own wild refuge. I'm Marty Stauffer. Until next time, enjoy our wild America.